The dust settled over the burned remains of the Hartley homestead like a shroud of grief, thick and suffocating in the late afternoon heat. Sarah Hartley stood at the edge of what had once been her front porch, her dress torn and blackened with soot, her hands trembling as they hung useless at her sides. The fire had taken everything. The house her husband had built with his own hands, plank by plank over 3 hard summers. The barn where their 2 horses had slept. The chicken coop that had promised eggs each morning. Even the small vegetable garden she had tended with such care, now trampled and scorched beyond recognition. But worse than all of that, far worse, was the fresh grave she had dug with blistered hands, just beyond the property line, where the prairie grass still grew tall and untouched by flame. Thomas Hartley had been a good man, a quiet man who worked from sunup to sundown, who kissed her forehead each morning before heading out to mend fences or tend the cattle they could barely afford to keep. He had dreamed of building something lasting, something they could pass down to the children they hoped to have. But 3 days ago, when the Cullen gang had ridden through looking for easy pickings, Thomas had stood his ground. He had told Sarah to hide in the root cellar, and she had heard everything. The shouts, the gunshots, the terrible silence that followed. When she finally climbed out hours later, she found him in the yard, still clutching the old rifle that had belonged to his father. Now she stood alone in a world that had become suddenly, impossibly vast. The sky stretched endlessly above her, that brilliant western blue that had once filled her with hope, but now seemed indifferent to her suffering. The wind whispered through the scorched timbers, carrying the acrid smell of destruction. She had no family left back east, no money hidden away, no skills that would earn her a living in town. Thomas had been her whole world, and now that world had been reduced to ash and memory. She didn't hear the horse approach. Exhaustion had dulled her senses, and grief had made her careless. When the shadow fell across her, she started, spinning around with wide eyes, half expecting the Cullens to have returned to finish what they had started. Instead, she found herself looking up at a man she recognized from town. Cole Brennan, the rancher who owned the spread 5 miles north, the largest outfit in the territory. He sat tall in the saddle, his weathered face half hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but his eyes were soft with something that looked like understanding. He dismounted slowly, as if afraid any sudden movement might shatter her completely. He was older than Thomas had been, somewhere in his early 40s, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines carved deep around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. He had always struck her as a solitary figure, a man who kept his own counsel and asked nothing from anyone. She had heard stories about him in town, that he had lost his wife to cholera 10 years back, that he ran his ranch with quiet efficiency and paid his men fair wages, that he was honest in his dealings and hard as iron when crossed. He stood before her now, holding his hat in his hands, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he looked past her at the ruins, at the fresh, turned earth of the grave, and something shifted in his expression. Without a word, he walked back to his horse and untied the bedroll from behind his saddle. He shook out a thick wool blanket, gray and worn but clean, and returned to where she stood frozen in place. She flinched when he approached, but he moved with careful deliberation, as one might approach a wounded animal. He draped the blanket around her shoulders, and only then did she realize she was shaking, her whole body trembling with cold despite the heat of the day. The shock was setting in, she dimly understood, the reality of everything she had lost finally breaking through the numbness that had carried her through the last 72 hours. "I have nothing left," she heard herself say, the words escaping in a whisper so raw it hardly sounded like her own voice. "Nothing." Cole Brennan looked at her for a long moment, his hands still resting lightly on her shoulders where he had settled the blanket. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady, with a certainty that cut through the chaos in her mind. "You have me." The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Sarah stared at him, unable to process what he was offering, unable to understand why this man, this near stranger, would speak such a thing to her. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something there that gave weight to his words. Not pity, exactly, though there was compassion there. Not obligation, though he was clearly a man who took responsibility seriously. It was something deeper, something that spoke of his own losses, his own understanding of what it meant to stand in the ruins of a life and wonder how to take the next breath. I don't understand, she managed, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. I know what you're feeling, he said quietly. Not exactly, maybe, but close enough. 10 years ago. I stood in a different place, looking at a different grave, and I thought the same thing you're thinking now. That there was no point in going on. That the world had taken everything that mattered. He paused, glancing back at the burned homestead before returning his gaze to her. But I was wrong. The world hadn't taken everything. I still had the ranch, and I still had my own 2 hands, and I still had the choice to keep breathing, or to lie down and die. I chose to keep breathing. Some days that was the only choice I could make, but I made it. And eventually, there came a day when I woke up and realized I wanted to keep breathing, not just because I had to, but because there were still things worth living for. Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes, the first tears she had allowed herself since finding Thomas in the yard. But what do I have? What's left? You have yourself, Cole said firmly. You have your strength, even if you can't feel it right now. You have tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days that follow. And you have an offer, if you'll take it. She waited, hardly daring to breathe. Come work at my ranch, he said. I need someone to help with the house, to handle the cooking and mending, and the dozen other things that keep a place running. It's honest work, and it pays fair. You'll have a roof over your head, food in your belly, and time to figure out what comes next. No strings attached. Just work and wages and a chance to find your feet again. Sarah wanted to refuse. Pride dictated that she should refuse, that accepting charity from a man she barely knew was a kind of defeat. But pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. And somewhere beneath the grief and shock, a small voice of survival was whispering that this was a lifeline, perhaps the only one she would get. Why would you do this? She asked, her voice breaking. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Cole's expression softened, and for a moment she saw past the weathered exterior to the lonely man beneath. Maybe I don't. But maybe that's exactly why I should. Because nobody owes anybody anything in this world, Mrs. Hartley, and that means every kindness is a choice. I'm choosing to offer you one. What you do with it is up to you. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that seemed too beautiful for such a terrible day. Sarah looked one last time at the ruins of her home, at the grave where her husband lay, and felt something crack open inside her chest. The grief would not leave her. She knew that with terrible certainty. But perhaps Cole Brennan was right. Perhaps she could choose to keep breathing, one day at a time, until breathing became something more than just an act of survival. All right, she whispered. All right? Cole nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect. He helped her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, keeping a careful distance between them. As they rode away from the Hartley place, Sarah did not look back. She could not bear to. Instead, she focused on the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves, on the solid presence of the man behind her, on the simple fact that she was still alive and that, somehow, she would have to find a way to make that mean something. The Brennan Ranch sprawled across a valley, between 2 ridges of red rock, a collection of sturdy buildings that spoke of prosperity earned through hard work and careful management. The main house was a 2-story structure with a wide porch, painted white, but weathered by sun and wind. The barn was easily 3 times the size of the one Thomas had built, with a corral that held at least 20 horses. There were outbuildings for equipment and supplies, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and beyond it all, pastures where cattle grazed in the fading light. Cole introduced her to his foreman, a grizzled man named Jack Hutchins who regarded her with curiosity, but no judgment, and to the 3 ranch hands who worked the spread. They tipped their hats to her respectfully, and she realized that Cole must have raised them right. Must have built a culture of decency on his land. He showed her to a small but clean room on the second floor of the main house, with a bed covered in a handmade quilt and a window that looked out over the valley. "You'll take your meals with me in the main dining room," he said from the doorway. "The hands eat in the bunkhouse, but you're not a hand. You're the housekeeper, and you'll be treated accordingly. If any of them give you trouble, you tell me. They know better, but just in case." Sarah nodded, unable to find words. The room was simple, but after 3 days of horror, it felt like a sanctuary. Cole seemed to understand her need for solitude. "Get some rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow will be soon enough to start figuring things out." But sleep would not come that night, despite her exhaustion. Sarah lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her, and felt the full weight of her loss pressing down on her chest. She wept silently into the pillow, mourning not just Thomas but the future they had planned, the children who would never be born, the life that had been stolen from her by men whose faces she had never even seen. She wept until there were no tears left, and then she lay in the darkness, hollow and aching, waiting for the dawn. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of routine and numbness. Sarah threw herself into the work of running the household with an almost desperate intensity, as if staying busy could keep the grief at bay. She cooked hearty meals for Cole and his men, scrubbed floors until her knees ached, mended clothes and linens, tended the kitchen garden, and managed the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch house functioning. Cole paid her wages every week, counting out the money with quiet respect, never asking her what she planned to do with it, never pressing her for conversation she was not ready to give. He was a considerate employer, perhaps the most considerate she could have imagined. He gave her space when she needed it, but he was also present in a way that made her feel less alone. Sometimes in the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit on the porch together in companionable silence, watching the sun set over the valley. He never pushed her to talk about what had happened, never offered empty platitudes about time healing all wounds. He simply existed beside her, solid and steady, a reminder that the world still held people who knew how to be kind without expecting anything in return. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift inside Sarah. The acute agony of her loss gradually transformed into a duller, more manageable ache. She found herself taking notice of small things again. The way the morning light slanted through the kitchen windows, the taste of coffee sweetened with honey, the satisfaction of bread dough rising beneath her hands. She began to remember Thomas not just as a dead man in the yard, but as he had been in life, his laugh, his gentleness, the way he had looked at her, as if she were the most precious thing in his world. The memories hurt, but they also brought a bittersweet comfort, a reminder that what they had shared had been real and good, even if it had ended too soon. 6 weeks after arriving at the Brennan Ranch, Sarah woke one morning and realized that she wanted to live. Not just survive, not just go through the motions, but actually live, to find purpose and perhaps even joy again. The realization startled her, brought a fresh wave of guilt. How could she want to move forward when Thomas was still so recently in the ground? But as she lay in bed, watching the dawn light creep across the ceiling, she understood something important. Thomas would have wanted her to live. He had loved her too much to wish her a lifetime of grief. And Cole Brennan, in his quiet way, had given her the space and safety to come to this realization on her own. That evening, as they sat together on the porch, Sarah finally broke the silence that had stretched between them for weeks. "Thank you," she said simply. Cole turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. "For what?" "For giving me time. For not expecting me to be anything other than what I was. For the blanket." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That old thing. It's seen better days. It was exactly what I needed," Sarah said, and she meant it in ways that went far beyond the physical warmth the blanket had provided. "You were exactly what I needed, even though I didn't know it at the time." They sat in silence for a while longer. But it was a different kind of silence now, charged with unspoken understanding. Finally, Cole spoke, his voice low and careful. "I meant what I said that day, Sarah. You have me for as long as you need. Whether that's as an employer, or a friend, or—" He trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. Sarah's heart beat faster. She had been so consumed by grief that she had not allowed herself to acknowledge what was growing between them, the connection that had formed in the spaces between words. But she felt it now, undeniable and frightening and somehow right. "I don't know what I'm ready for," she said honestly. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready for what you might be suggesting. But I know that being here with you has saved my life in ways I can't even begin to explain." "That's enough," Cole said firmly. "That's more than enough." The months passed, turning summer into fall and fall into the hard edges of winter. The Cullen gang was finally caught by a U.S. Marshal. Their reign of terror ended in a shootout near the Arizona border. Sarah felt a grim satisfaction at the news, though it brought no real closure. Thomas would still be dead no matter what happened to the men who had killed him. Justice, she had learned, was a cold comfort compared to the warmth of a living presence. But she had found other sources of warmth. The ranch hands treated her with growing affection, bringing her wildflowers they found in the high meadows or offering to chop extra firewood for her stove. Jack Hutchins, the gruff foreman, began teaching her to ride properly, insisting that anyone who lived on a ranch should know how to handle a horse. And Cole remained her anchor, her steady presence, never pushing but always there, waiting with infinite patience for her to find her way forward. It was on a cold December evening, with snow falling softly outside and a fire crackling in the hearth, that Sarah finally understood what she wanted. She and Cole were sitting in the main room, she with her mending, and he with the account books he insisted on keeping meticulously updated. The domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly. How natural it felt, how right. They had fallen into patterns of partnership without her even noticing, each anticipating the other's needs, moving through the spaces of the house and the rhythms of daily life with the ease of people who belonged together. She set down her mending and looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just the rancher who had offered her a job, but the man who had offered her himself. He must have felt her gaze because he glanced up from his ledgers, a question in his eyes. "Cole," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "That blanket you gave me all those months ago. Yes, I'd like to share it with you." Understanding dawned in his face, followed by something that looked like joy tempered with caution. He set aside his books and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her so they were at eye level. "Are you sure?" he asked gently. "I don't want you to feel obligated. I don't want you to think you owe me anything." Sarah reached out and took his weathered hands in hers, feeling the calluses earned through years of hard work, seeing the scars that told stories of a life lived fully despite its sorrows. "I'm not saying this because I owe you," she said firmly. "I'm saying it because somewhere along the way, in between the grief and the healing, I started to fall in love with you. I didn't think I could love anyone again after Thomas, and maybe I can't love you in exactly the same way. But what I feel for you is real and deep and true, and I think you feel the same." Cole's eyes gleamed in the firelight, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I loved my wife with everything I had, and when she died, I thought that was the end of loving for me. But you've shown me that the heart has more room than we think, that we can honor the past and still reach for the future. I do love you, Sarah. I think I started falling the moment I saw you standing in those ruins, so brave and so broken, and I knew I had to try to help put you back together." "You did more than that," Sarah whispered. "You gave me back to myself." They came together then, not with desperate passion, but with the tender certainty of two people who had walked through fire and emerged on the other side, scarred but whole. The kiss was gentle, an exchange of promises and possibilities, a recognition that what they were building together was not a replacement for what they had lost, but something new and precious in its own right. In the spring, they were married in a simple ceremony on the ranch, with Jack Hutchins and the ranch hands as witnesses and wildflowers blooming across the valley in riotous profusion. Sarah wore a simple dress of blue calico, and Cole wore his best suit, and when they exchanged vows, there was not a dry eye among the assembled company. They spoke their promises with the gravity of people who understood that love was not always easy, that it required courage and commitment and the willingness to be vulnerable, even when vulnerability felt terrifying. That night, as they stood together on the porch looking out over land that now belonged to both of them, Sarah thought about all the ways a life could break and be reformed into something unexpected and beautiful. She thought about Thomas, who would always hold a place in her heart, and about the woman she had been when she stood in the ruins of her first home, believing she had nothing left. She thought about the blanket Cole had wrapped around her shoulders, and how sometimes the smallest gestures of kindness could change the entire trajectory of a life. "What are you thinking?" Cole asked, wrapping his arm around her waist. Sarah leaned into him, solid and warm and alive, and smiled. "I'm thinking about what you told me that day, that I had you. And I'm thinking about how right you were, even though I couldn't see it at the time. And now I know that having you was everything I needed to find my way back to having myself. And having both of those things, having us, that's more than I ever imagined I could have again." They stood together in the gathering darkness, two people who had each known loss and loneliness, and had found in each other not just comfort but renewal. The stars emerged one by one above them, ancient lights that had witnessed countless human dramas, countless stories of sorrow and survival. Sarah knew there would be hard days ahead, that grief did not simply disappear because new love had entered her life. But she also knew, with a certainty that ran bone deep, that she would face those days with strength drawn not just from Cole's presence, but from her own resilience, from the knowledge that she had already survived the unsurvivable. The wind whispered across the valley, carrying with it the scent of sage and new grass, the promise of seasons turning and life continuing in all its messy, painful, glorious complexity. And in that moment, wrapped in the arms of a man who had taught her that endings could also be beginnings, Sarah Hartley Brennan understood that sometimes the greatest gift we can offer another person is not to fix their brokenness, but to stand witness to it, to offer shelter and space and the simple, profound reassurance that they do not have to face the darkness alone. She had lost everything, and in losing everything, she had found something she never knew to look for, a different kind of love, born not from innocence, but from understanding, not from passion alone, but from the deep recognition of shared humanity. It was a love built on ashes and watered with tears, but it was real and it was hers, and that made it worth every moment of pain it had taken to find. The ranch stretched out before them, bathed in starlight, full of possibility and promise. And for the first time since that terrible day, when her world had burned, Sarah looked toward tomorrow not with dread but with hope, knowing that whatever came, she would face it not alone, but beside someone who had taught her that even when we have nothing left, sometimes what remains is exactly enough to build a new beginning.